I am Harrison, 34 years old. For the last 8 years, I have poured every ounce of my blood, sweat, and sanity into building my restaurant from absolute nothing. And just 2 months ago, my own wife looked me dead in the eye and demanded I hand the entire business over to her deadbeat brother as a wedding gift. While I was standing in the kitchen I built with my own 2 hands, covered in grease and ash from a 14-hour shift, my wife Vanessa casually leaned against my stainless steel prep counter. She crossed her arms, perfectly manicured nails tapping against her expensive coat, and told me, "It's a family tradition, Harrison. When someone in our family gets married, we all pitch in to help them start their new life. Julian deserves this. You can always start another little project." She wanted to give my multimillion-dollar business away like a cheap blender on a wedding registry. She actually rolled her eyes when I stood there in stunned silence, completely dismissing my life's work as if it were a minor hobby I was being selfish about. But there was one thing she didn't know. I had already secured the deed to my restaurant in an untouchable corporate trust, and my lawyer had just finished installing a legal trap so tightly wound it would snap their entire world in half. And now, they are the ones begging for mercy, facing absolute financial ruin, and trying to dodge a massive lawsuit. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their entitlement piece by piece and exposed them to the entire town, hit that like button if you believe a man's hard work belongs to him, not his greedy in-laws. And don't forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Now, let's go back to the exact moment my marriage shattered into a million pieces. It was a late Tuesday afternoon, right before the dinner rush hit. If you have ever worked in the restaurant industry, you know the exact kind of electric, nervous energy that hums through a kitchen just before the doors open. The air inside Iron and Oak, my barbecue and smokehouse, was thick with the heavy, mouth-watering scent of hickory wood, caramelized brown sugar, and slow-smoked brisket. I had been awake since 3 in the morning. That is not an exaggeration. When you smoke meat the right way, the old-fashioned way, you do not get to sleep in. You nurse those fires in the freezing dark. My hands were calloused, my forearms were marked with dozens of tiny, faded burn scars from hot grates, and my back carried that deep, satisfying ache that only comes from a day of honest, brutal labor. I was at the main prep station, meticulously sharpening my carving knives, when the heavy swinging doors of the kitchen pushed open. In walked Vanessa, my wife of 4 years. She looked completely out of place, an alien invading my sanctuary. While my crew and I were covered in flour, sauce, and charcoal dust, Vanessa was wearing a pristine, cream-colored designer trench coat. She had her sunglasses pushed up into her flawlessly blown-out hair, carrying a leather handbag that cost more than my entire first food truck. She usually avoided coming to the restaurant at all costs. She hated the smell. She claimed the hickory smoke clung to her clothes and ruined her expensive perfumes. So, seeing her standing there, right in the middle of the chaos, instantly put me on edge. I wiped my hands on a heavily stained towel, forcing a smile as I walked over. I asked her what brought her to this side of town so early. She didn't offer a hug. She didn't lean in for a kiss. She just looked around the kitchen with a faint, unmistakable expression of disgust, like she was inspecting a public restroom. She cleared her throat and said we needed to talk about Julian's wedding present. Julian is her younger brother. He is 28 years old, permanently unemployed, and possesses an ego the size of a blimp. He is the quintessential golden child of her family. He was getting married to a very sweet, quiet woman named Fiona in a few months. The entire family had been buzzing about this wedding for a year, treating it like a royal coronation. I assumed Vanessa was here to ask for a large check. Maybe she wanted to dip into our savings to buy them a luxury honeymoon, or perhaps contribute to a down payment on some prime real estate. Honestly, I was fully prepared to write a substantial check. Iron and Oak was pulling in fantastic numbers, my salary was more than comfortable, and I genuinely believed in helping family. Then she dropped the bomb. "Julian wants to be an entrepreneur, Harrison," Vanessa said, her tone light and conversational, as if she were discussing the weather. "He wants to be his own boss. He has such great vision. And since Iron and Oak is practically running itself now, I think we should transfer ownership to him. It would be the absolute perfect wedding gift. I stared at her. My brain literally stopped processing information for a full 5 seconds. I waited for her to laugh. I waited for her to tell me it was a ridiculous joke she heard at the country club. But her face was deadpan. She was staring back at me with the cold, unblinking expectation of a woman who always got exactly what she demanded. I found my voice, though it sounded incredibly hollow. I asked her to repeat herself. I asked her if she seriously expected me to hand over a thriving, highly profitable business to a 28-year-old man who couldn't even manage to wake up before noon, let alone manage a payroll of 40 employees. That is when the mask slipped and the condescension poured out. "Harrison, please don't be difficult," she sighed, waving her hand dismissively. "It's a family tradition. When my cousin got married, my uncle gave them a luxury car. My parents set up a massive college fund for my sister's kids. When a member of this family starts a new chapter, we set them up for success. We have the restaurant. It's the logical choice. Julian has amazing ideas to modernize this place. You've done the grunt work, which is great, but he can take it to the next level." I gripped the edge of the steel prep counter. I gripped it so hard I thought the metal might bend. My heart was slamming against my ribs like a trapped bird. She called 8 years of my life grunt work. She looked at my sleepless nights, my panic attacks over making rent in the early days, my ruined credit score before the business took off, and she reduced it all to a stepping stone for her lazy, entitled brother. I looked deeply into my wife's eyes, and for the very first time in our relationship, the fog lifted. I did not see a loving partner. I saw a parasite. I saw a woman who viewed my blood, sweat, and success as nothing more than a convenient asset to be liquidated to maintain her family's absurd social standing. The sheer, breathtaking entitlement was so deeply ingrained in her bones that she honestly could not comprehend why I wasn't eagerly handing over the keys. If I lost my temper right then, if I screamed, threw a plate, or kicked her out of my kitchen, I would lose the war. She would immediately run crying to her wealthy parents. They would hire vicious divorce attorneys, freeze my assets, and drag me through a legal hellscape, painting me as an abusive, greedy outsider who refused to support his family. I needed time. I needed strategy. I forced my hands to relax. I took a slow, deep breath of the smoky air, grounding myself in the reality of the restaurant I owned. "Vanessa," I said, keeping my voice terrifyingly level. "A transfer of a corporate entity is not like handing over the keys to a sedan. It involves massive tax implications, commercial leases, employee contracts, and liabilities. I cannot just sign a piece of paper today. I need to consult with my accountant and look at the legal logistics." Her face immediately brightened. She heard the word logistics and assumed I had surrendered. She stepped forward, finally leaning in to kiss my cheek. I had to force myself not to physically recoil from her touch. "I knew you would understand, honey," she whispered happily. "Family always comes first. Julian is going to be so thrilled." She turned around and walked out of the kitchen, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. She left behind a trail of heavy floral perfume that clashed violently with the smell of my smoked brisket. I stood alone in the kitchen, listening to the hum of the massive walk-in refrigerators. She truly thought she had one. She thought I was just going to roll over, abandon my identity, and let her brother hijack my American dream. But she had just declared war, and I was going to make absolutely sure it was a war her family would never recover from. To truly comprehend the sheer, unadulterated audacity of Vanessa's demand, you have to understand the massive chasm between how I grew up and the delusional bubble her family lived in. I was raised in a blue-collar neighborhood where the word inheritance wasn't even in our vocabulary. My parents worked grueling shifts just to keep the lights on and put food on the table. There was no secret college fund waiting for me. There was no safety net. When I turned 18, I was on my own. When I was 26, I took a massive, terrifying leap of faith. I emptied out my meager savings account, maxed out 3 separate high-interest credit cards, and bought a beaten-up, rusted-out step van that used to belong to a plumbing company. I spent 6 months of my life parked in my parents' driveway, watching online tutorials on my cracked phone screen, learning how to weld sheet metal, how to rewire electrical panels, and how to build a custom, heavy-duty meat smoker from scratch. I drove that food truck to industrial parks at 3 in the morning in the freezing, pouring rain. I stood over hot coals serving pulled pork sandwiches to factory workers coming off the graveyard shift. I worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week, for 3 straight years. I smelled like onions and grease so permanently that I stopped noticing it. I missed Thanksgiving dinners, I missed birthdays, I missed living a normal life. When I finally scraped together enough capital to sign a commercial lease on a rundown warehouse building on the edge of town, I didn't hire contractors. I did the plumbing myself. I painted the walls myself. I built the tables myself. Slowly, agonizingly, iron and oak grew. The food spoke for itself. Lines started forming around the block. I hired a crew, trained them to treat the food with respect, and built a community staple. Every single dollar in my bank account was earned through unrelenting, bone-crushing grit. Vanessa's family operated in a completely different universe. Richard and Martha, my in-laws, were the definition of generational wealth. Not billionaires, but country club members who sat on homeowner association boards just to fine their neighbors for having the wrong shade of grass. From the very first day Vanessa brought me to their sprawling estate, I was treated like a charity case. They smiled with their teeth, but their eyes were always calculating my net worth. They would introduce me to their wealthy friends by saying, "This is Harrison, he works in food service," with this specific tone of voice that made it sound like I was scraping gum off the bottom of diner tables. And then there was Julian. Julian was the undisputed prince of the family. While I was burning my hands on hot metal grates to pay my electric bill, Julian was failing his introductory business classes at an expensive private university, completely bankrolled by his parents. When he finally managed to graduate, 2 years late, Richard and Martha didn't tell him to get a job. They bought him a brand new Porsche, a $100,000 sports car for a guy who couldn't even wake up for a morning lecture. They financed his entrepreneurial dreams over and over again. First, it was a tech app that burned through 50 grand and never launched. Then, it was a boutique fitness center that folded in 6 months because Julian refused to show up and manage the staff. Every single time he failed, Richard and Martha were there, checkbook in hand, bailing him out, smoothing over the embarrassment, and constantly reassuring him that the world simply wasn't ready for his brilliant vision. He was 28 years old and had never faced a single genuine consequence in his entire existence. 3 days after Vanessa ambushed me in my kitchen, we were obligated to attend a family dinner at Richard and Martha's house. I spent the entire drive there gripping the steering wheel, trying to regulate my breathing. I hated these dinners. The dining room was always aggressively air-conditioned. The silver cutlery was unnecessarily heavy, and the conversation was always a thinly veiled interrogation designed to make me feel small. I sat at the long mahogany table, pushing a piece of dry salmon around my plate, while Julian held court. He was loudly bragging about his upcoming wedding, the extravagant country club venue Fiona had supposedly chosen, and how he was finally ready to settle down and become a pillar of the local business community. Sitting directly across from me was Uncle Gregory. Gregory was a slimy, fast-talking real estate broker who wore suits that were a little too tight and constantly evaluated people as if they were properties to be flipped. He took a long sip of his red wine, leaned back in his chair, and locked eyes with me. "So, Harrison," Gregory drawled, his voice booming over the quiet clinking of silverware. The entire table went dead silent. "Vanessa tells us you're finally ready to pass the torch. I think it's a brilliant strategic move. That little barbecue joint of yours is sitting on a prime piece of commercial real estate. Julian could really optimize the cash flow. Maybe bring in some real investors, tear down the aesthetic, turn it into a high-end franchise. Upgrade the clientele if you catch my drift." Martha smiled a tight, triumphant, plastic smile. Richard nodded slowly in profound approval. Julian sat there, swirling the wine in his glass, looking at me with this smug, infuriatingly entitled smirk. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. They had already planned this. They had sat around this exact mahogany table, probably weeks ago, and discussed my business as if it were a piece of inherited family property waiting to be divided. They had completely bypassed my agency. To them, I was just a placeholder, a blue-collar worker keeping the seat warm until the real businessman of the family was ready to step in and take the crown. I looked sharply at Vanessa. She was staring intently at her napkin, violently avoiding my gaze. She had fed them this narrative. She had promised them my life. I slowly placed my fork down on the china plate. The sharp clink echoed in the silent room. I didn't yell. I didn't flip the table, even though every instinct in my body screamed at me to do so. I just looked directly into Gregory's eyes and kept my voice dangerously soft. "Iron and oak isn't a little joint, Gregory," I said, articulating every single syllable. "It employs 40 hardworking people and grosses over $3 million a year. It requires a highly specific, specialized skill set to run. It is not a hobby for amateurs." Julian actually scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Oh, come on, Harry. The smoked meat. How hard can it possibly be? You throw some brisket in a hot oven, slap some sweet sauce on it, and charge $25 a plate. It's basically an automated cash machine. I've already got a whole modernization strategy mapped out. We can automate half the prep work, bring in pre-cooked bases, and cut the overhead by 30%. He was openly talking about destroying my life's work right to my face. He was talking about firing my loyal staff. He was talking about replacing my handmade dry rubs and 16-hour smoking process with cheap, automated garbage. He wanted to gut the soul of my restaurant for a quick, lazy payout. "Is that your plan, Julian?" I asked, my voice dropping an octave. "Well, a transfer of commercial assets of that magnitude involves a massive amount of legal red tape. We have to look at the tax implications, the liabilities, the employee contracts. I have my corporate lawyers looking into the preliminary steps right now." Richard chimed in immediately, his tone adopting that authoritative, patriarchal bark he used when he wanted to end a conversation. "Let's not overcomplicate this, Harrison. Keep the lawyers out of it as much as possible. This is a private family transaction. Just sign the deed over, and I will have my personal accountant handle the back-end numbers. We want this finalized and announced before the wedding." The suffocating arrogance of these people was paralyzing. They weren't asking me. They were commanding me. I stood up from the table, my chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. I cited a sudden, severe migraine and excused myself. Vanessa hissed at me under her breath as I turned away, gripping my wrist and whispering that I was embarrassing her. I didn't even look down at her. I pulled my arm free, walked out the heavy oak front door, got into my truck, and locked the doors. I sat in the darkness of the driveway for a long, quiet time. My marriage was an absolute farce. My wife was nothing more than a sleeper agent for her parasitic family. They wanted to strip me down, take my golden goose, and throw me out in the cold the moment I had built something of tangible value. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a pure, concentrated rage that felt like gasoline burning in my veins. I dialed a number I had prayed I would never need to use for a domestic issue. It was Sylvia. Sylvia is a high-powered corporate attorney I retained a few years ago to handle my commercial leases. She is a legal shark in a tailored pantsuit, a woman who eats hostile corporate takeovers for breakfast and does not know the meaning of the word mercy. She answered on the second ring. I laid it all out. I told her exactly what Vanessa demanded in the kitchen. I told her what Julian planned to do to the business. I told her the family expected me to quietly surrender the deed to avoid a scandal. I told her I needed to protect my assets, shield my employees from being fired, and prepare for a divorce that was guaranteed to be nuclear. Sylvia listened in absolute silence. When I finally finished speaking, she didn't offer me empty apologies or fake sympathy. She simply said, "Harrison, by the time we are done with these people, they won't even own the designer clothes on their backs. Be at my office tomorrow morning at exactly 8 o'clock. We are going to build a cage." The following morning, The city was draped in a cold, gray drizzle. I sat in Sylvia's immaculate high-rise office overlooking the downtown skyline, clutching a cup of black coffee. For 4 uninterrupted hours, we meticulously crafted a legal trap perfectly disguised as a generous transfer agreement. Sylvia was a master tactician. She immediately recognized the danger. If I simply walked into the house and outright refused to hand over the restaurant, Vanessa would instantly file for a hostile divorce. She would drag me into family court, weaponize her parents' endless legal fund, and try to claim half of Iron and Oak as marital property, effectively forcing me to liquidate the business just to pay her off. We could not let that happen. We needed to make it look, on paper, like I was happily and willingly cooperating with the family tradition. But simultaneously, we needed to legally prove that Julian was grossly incompetent and completely unfit to take over, thereby securing my sole ownership through an undeniable, ironclad paper trail. We drafted a conditional transfer contract. It was a masterpiece of legal maneuvering. It explicitly stated that Julian would receive full ownership of the business, but only after completing a rigorous, heavily documented 3-month probationary period acting as the general manager. The conditions were brutal but entirely standard for the industry. He had to maintain the current exact profit margins. He was strictly prohibited from firing any core staff members. He had to pass a basic culinary and food safety certification. And most importantly, he could not change any of our food suppliers without my explicit, notarized written approval. If he violated even one of these terms during the 90 days, the transfer agreement would be immediately rendered null and void, the offer would be permanently rescinded, and the business would remain under my sole ownership forever. He is going to hate this, I told Sylvia, staring down at the dense, intimidating pages of legal jargon. He wants the keys to the castle and the bank accounts. He doesn't want a job application. Exactly, Sylvia smiled, a cold, predatory gleam in her eyes as she capped her expensive fountain pen. And when he inevitably tries to cut corners, when his ego forces him to break the rules because he thinks he's above them, you will have a legally documented, undeniable breach of contract. We aren't going to fight him, Harrison. We are going to let him bury himself in his own incompetence. 2 days later, I called for a formal meeting at the restaurant. I scheduled it for mid-morning, long before we opened the doors to the public, ensuring the dining room was completely empty and silent. I sat alone at a large corner booth, the printed contract resting in a leather binder in front of me. At exactly 10 o'clock, Vanessa and Julian walked through the front doors. Julian was wearing a sharply tailored, ridiculously expensive Italian suit, looking like an investment banker about to close a Wall Street merger instead of a guy walking into a barbecue joint. He looked around the rustic dining room with absolute, undisguised disdain, his nose physically wrinkling at the faint, lingering smell of grease and hickory smoke. Vanessa looked triumphant, a smug little smile playing on her lips. She thought this was the surrender ceremony. I slid the leather binder across the polished wooden table. "This is the official transfer agreement," I said smoothly, keeping my face entirely blank. My corporate lawyer drafted it to ensure a clean legal transition of assets. Read it carefully. Julian picked it up with a confident smirk, flipping past the first few pages. But as his eyes hit the clauses detailing the probationary period, his smirk vanished. His face contorted into an ugly, dark scowl. "What is this absolute garbage?" he snapped, aggressively tossing the binder back onto the table. "A 3-month probation? Maintaining the current staff? A food safety test? This isn't a wedding gift, Harrison. This is a hostage situation. You're trying to make me your employee. It is standard corporate procedure," I lied effortlessly, leaning back in my booth. "You are attempting to take over a highly complex, multi-million-dollar operation. I have 40 families relying on me for their paychecks. I need legal assurance that you won't run this place into the ground on your first day." "Run it into the ground?" Julian scoffed, his voice echoing loudly in the empty restaurant. He slammed his hand on the table. "I am going to save this place. Do you have any idea how much money you are bleeding every month? Your labor costs are a joke. Hector makes way too much money for a guy who just stands around flipping meat all day. The minute I'm in charge, we fire him. We bring in minimum wage high school kids. And we are immediately switching our supplier to Dominic's Wholesale. We can buy frozen, pre-cut meat for half the price and double our profit margins instantly. I felt a wave of cold, calculating fury settle deep in my chest. BP Truong Hector had been with me since the very first day in the freezing food truck. He was a master of his craft, the heart and soul of the kitchen. And Dominic's Wholesale was notorious in the city for selling near-expired, low-grade, injected meat that would absolutely destroy my restaurant's reputation within a single week. Julian didn't care about quality. He didn't care about the community. He only saw fast, easy dollar signs. He wanted to gut my legacy for a quick payout. The conditions outlined in that document are non-negotiable, Julian, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You want the business? You prove you have the discipline to run it my way first. Sign the contract or the deal is permanently off the table. Right here, right now. Vanessa grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging painfully through my shirt into my skin. Harrison, you are being completely unreasonable and incredibly insulting. He is family. You do not test family like this. I am protecting my investment until the transfer is finalized. I shot back, violently shaking her hand off my arm. I glared at her. Take it or leave it. Julian glared at me. His jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. He looked at Vanessa. She gave him a subtle, urgent, desperate nod. Gritting his teeth in fury, Julian snatched a gold pen from his jacket pocket and aggressively slashed his signature across the dotted line. Fine, he spat, throwing the pen on the table. But the absolute second those 90 days are up, I am clearing house. You're obsolete, Harrison. He stormed out of the restaurant, the heavy glass door slamming shut behind him. Vanessa trailed after him, but not before turning back to shoot me a look of pure, toxic venom. I calmly took the signed document, folded it neatly, and locked it inside the heavy steel safe in my private office. Step 1 was perfectly executed. But the real twist, the horrifying piece of information that would turn this entire situation from a simple business dispute into a highly explosive weapon, arrived exactly 2 days later. I was in the back office, running the weekly inventory numbers, when my cell phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. The text message asked me to meet at a small, independent, out-of-the-way coffee shop on the far side of town. The message explicitly said it was a matter of life and death, and strictly confidential. Highly suspicious, but undeniably curious, I grabbed my coat and drove over. I walked into the quiet, dimly lit cafe and scanned the room. Sitting in a dark corner booth, wearing an oversized gray sweater, her face hidden behind dark sunglasses, was Fiona, Julian's fiancée. I walked over and slid into the booth across from her. She looked absolutely terrified. Her skin was incredibly pale, and her hands were physically shaking as she clutched a paper cup of tea. Fiona? I asked softly, genuinely concerned. What is going on? Are you all right? She took a deep, shuddering breath, pulled off her sunglasses, and revealed eyes that were red and swollen from crying. She reached into her large canvas tote bag, pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder, and slid it across the wooden table toward me. I found this hidden inside an air vent in Julian's home office yesterday, she whispered, her voice cracking. I was looking for the spare guest list for the wedding invitations. I swear to God I wasn't snooping, but the grate was loose and the folder fell out. I opened it. I opened the heavy folder. Inside was a massive stack of financial documents. Bank statements showing zero balances. Maxed out credit card bills from banks I had never heard of. Extremely aggressive, final notice letters from vicious collection agencies. But that wasn't the worst part. Underneath the bank statements were printed ledgers from offshore sports betting websites and underground, unregulated poker rooms. I rapidly scanned the columns of red numbers, my stomach dropping to the floor. He's in debt, Fiona said, a single tear escaping and rolling down her cheek. Harrison, it is not just a few bad hands at a casino. He owes over $300,000. Some of it is to the credit card companies, but a lot of it is owed to very, very bad people. I found a handwritten, threatening note stuffed in the back of the folder. They know where our apartment is. They know where my parents live. The pieces of the puzzle violently, sickeningly snapped together in my mind. The frantic desperation, the sudden, absurd demand for my business, the aggressive plan to immediately cut costs, fire staff, and liquidate assets. Julian didn't want to be an entrepreneur. Julian was drowning. He owed dangerous, violent people a fortune, and Richard and Martha either couldn't afford to bail him out this time, or the loan sharks wouldn't take their checks. So they targeted the only available asset left, me. They were going to use iron and oak as a massive, untraceable ATM to save Julian's skin, destroying my life's work and my employees' livelihoods in the process, just to pay off a gambling syndicate. Does Vanessa know? I asked, my voice barely a raspy whisper. Fiona nodded miserably, burying her face in her hands. I confronted him last night. He completely broke down. He admitted everything. He told me that Vanessa and his parents have known the entire time. They've known for months. The whole plan to get your restaurant. It was a coordinated family effort. They needed to get him access to a high-cash flow business immediately so he could skim money off the top and pay down the violent debt before his kneecaps get broken. A wave of profound nausea washed over me. I felt physically sick. My own wife, the woman who stood at an altar and swore to protect me. She was actively, willingly participating in a scheme to sacrifice my livelihood, my future, and the jobs of 40 innocent people, just to cover up her degenerate brother's criminal gambling addiction. The betrayal was so profoundly deep, so fundamentally evil, that it actually knocked the breath completely out of my lungs. Fiona, I said, looking at the devastated woman weeping across from me. Why are you showing me all of this? You are supposed to marry him in less than a month. Fiona wiped her eyes roughly with a napkin. Her expression suddenly hardened, the sorrow morphing into something resembling pure, unyielding steel. I refuse to marry a liar, she stated firmly. I refuse to tie my life, my future, and my potential children to a man who would steal from his own family to feed a sickness. I am going to call off the wedding, but I couldn't do it until I warned you. I needed you to know the truth before they ruin your life completely. An idea, brilliant, terrifying, and utterly devastating, began to take shape in my mind. Fiona, I said carefully, leaning across the table, do not call off the wedding. Not yet. She stared at me, thoroughly confused. What? Why? Because if you cancel the wedding today, they will panic. They will scramble and they will find another, more aggressive way to attack me. I explained, my mind working at 1,000,000 miles an hour. I need time to permanently secure my assets. I need time to set a legal trap they can never, ever escape from. I need you to play along. Act like everything is perfectly fine. Let them believe their disgusting plan is working flawlessly. Fiona looked down at the folder of debts, then back up at me. She took a deep, steadying breath, her resolve solidifying in her eyes. Okay, tell me exactly what you need me to do. We sat in that obscure coffee shop for another hour, meticulously formulating a counterstrike that would expose the horrific rot inside that family for the entire world to see. I had walked into that cafe as a man trying to save a restaurant. I was walking out as an executioner. The next 3 weeks were an excruciating, agonizing exercise in psychological warfare and absolute self-control. Every single night, I had to drive back to the house, walk through the front door, and play the role of the compliant, slightly stressed, but ultimately supportive husband. I had to sit at the dinner table and listen to Vanessa talk excitedly about the floral arrangements, the expensive catering, and the seating charts for Julian's lavish wedding, knowing full well she was actively plotting my financial execution behind her sweet smiles. Every time she smiled at me, it felt like chewing on broken glass. Every time she reached out to touch my arm or kiss my cheek, I had to physically suppress a violent shudder. I was sleeping next to a traitor. At the restaurant, I played the part of the defeated, exhausted owner slowly preparing for a transition of power. But behind closed doors, the resistance was building. I pulled Valerie, my fiercely loyal general manager, into my private office and locked the door. Valerie is a tough, no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had been by my side since the food truck days. She practically helped me build the smokers. When I laid out the entire truth, the massive gambling debts, the loan sharks, and the family's coordinated scheme to use our business as a sacrificial lamb to save Julian, she nearly threw a ceramic coffee mug straight through my office window. We are not letting that spoiled, parasitic brat touch a single cutting board in this place, Valerie hissed, pacing the floor of my office like a caged tiger. Tell me exactly what we are doing, boss. I am ready for war. We are going to let him dig his own grave, I told her, my voice eerily calm. But first, we need a massive security upgrade. Total surveillance. Over the following weekend, while Vanessa believed I was attending a 2-day regional catering convention in another city, Valerie and I brought in a highly specialized, private security contractor. We worked through the night. We ripped out the old, grainy, outdated security cameras that only covered the cash registers. In their place, we installed a state-of-the-art, 4K resolution, night vision-enabled surveillance system. But we didn't just cover the public areas. We placed hidden, microscopic cameras directly inside the main office. One was focused dead center on the heavy floor safe. Another had a perfect, unobstructed view of the computer terminal and the keyboard. We installed highly sensitive motion sensors at the back employee entrance and remote access software that linked the entire live feed directly to an encrypted server on my personal cell phone and laptop. Nobody, not even the rest of our trusted kitchen staff, knew the new, invisible system was active. Meanwhile, Fiona was executing her role as the inside operative flawlessly. She attended all the family dinners. She smiled brightly for the pre-wedding photo shoots, and she acted like the blissfully ignorant, excited bride-to-be. But every few days, late at night, she would send me encrypted text messages, updating me on Julian's rapidly deteriorating mental state. The loan sharks were getting incredibly impatient. The deadlines were closing in. Julian was panicking, aggressively pressuring Vanessa to manipulate me into signing the final, unconditional deed over to him before the wedding day, so he could immediately leverage the business for a massive cash loan. Vanessa increased her emotional manipulation tactics tenfold. She started crying on cue in the living room, telling me how incredibly stressed her elderly parents were, begging me to just finalize the paperwork so Julian could have peace of mind before he walked down the aisle. I fed her nothing but empty, bureaucratic promises. I told her the corporate lawyers were dragging their feet on finalizing the tax liability documents, and that everything would be ready very soon. I stalled and I watched them sweat. The absolute climax of their desperation, the moment that handed me the final, undeniable weapon I needed, happened exactly 1 week before the wedding. It was the night of Julian's bachelor party. Vanessa told me she was going over to her parents' sprawling estate for the night to help Martha assemble hundreds of complicated, last-minute wedding favors. I told her I needed a break from the stress and was going up to a rented cabin by the lake to do some quiet fishing and clear my head. I did not go to the lake. I drove 3 miles away from the restaurant and checked into a cheap, nondescript roadside motel under a fake name. I sat at a wobbly desk, opened my laptop, connected to the encrypted server, and logged into the live security feed. I sat there in the pitch-black room, drinking stale, bitter coffee from a styrofoam cup, staring at the glowing screens. I waited. At exactly 2:14 a.m., the silence of the motel room was broken. My cell phone violently buzzed on the desk. A high-priority motion alert from the restaurant's back alley camera. I leaned closer to the laptop screen, my heart rate accelerating. The high-definition camera showed a lone figure wearing a dark, oversized hoodie approaching the heavy steel rear employee entrance of iron and oak. The figure looked around nervously, peering into the dark alleyway, before pulling out a key. My stomach tightened into a hard knot. It was the emergency spare key. The only person I had ever given that key to was Vanessa years ago, in case I ever locked myself out. The heavy door clicked open. The figure slipped quickly inside the dark building. I immediately switched the feed to the interior hallway camera. The advanced night vision clicked on instantly, illuminating the dark corridor and the intruder in crisp, high-definition green light. The figure pulled the hood back from his head. It was Julian. He looked absolutely frantic. He was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with his sleeve despite the heavy air conditioning in the restaurant. He didn't walk toward the kitchen to check the equipment. He didn't walk toward the cash registers up front. He walked straight, purposefully, toward my locked private office. I switched the feed to the hidden camera mounted directly above my desk. Julian forced the office door open, breaking the lock I had intentionally weakened earlier that day, and stepped inside. He pulled a small, tactical flashlight from his pocket, the beam cutting through the darkness. He immediately dropped to his knees and went straight for the heavy steel floor safe hidden under the rug. He grabbed the dial and started spinning it rapidly, trying combinations. I watched him try his sister's birthday, his parents' anniversary, the restaurant's grand opening date. He was frantically trying to gain access to the physical property deeds and the emergency cash reserves I kept on hand for vendor emergencies. When the heavy steel door refused to budge, he let out a frustrated, angry string of curses, violently kicking the safe with his expensive shoes. Panting heavily, he stood up and turned his desperate attention to my computer terminal. He booted it up. The screen illuminated his panicked face. He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and started typing rapidly on the keyboard. He was trying various passwords, desperately trying to bypass the firewall to access the master accounting files. He was looking for bank routing numbers so he could electronically wire money directly out of my business accounts to pay off his violent creditors before they broke his legs. I sat alone in the cold motel room, watching my own brother-in-law commit felony breaking and entering, attempted burglary, and corporate espionage, all in glorious 4K resolution. I pressed the master record button. The software began saving the flawless, undeniable video evidence directly to multiple secure cloud servers. I could have picked up my phone and called 911 right then and there. I could have had the police surround the building and arrest him on the spot. But a quiet arrest in the middle of the night wasn't good enough. If I called the cops now, Vanessa and her wealthy parents would immediately swoop in. They would hire the most expensive defense attorneys in the state. They would claim it was a massive misunderstanding, that Julian was simply looking for a document I asked him to find. They would spin the narrative, painting me to the entire family and the community as the vindictive, cruel brother-in-law who tried to send a young man to prison over a simple mistake. They would sweep his crimes under their very expensive rug. No, that was absolutely not going to happen. The punishment had to fit the sheer, catastrophic magnitude of their betrayal. They wanted to humiliate me. They wanted to steal my life's work. They wanted to use me as a disposable shield. I was going to let them stand on the biggest, most public stage of their entire lives, surrounded by every single person they cared about and tried to impress. And then, I was going to pull the floor entirely out from under them. I watched the screen as Julian finally gave up, slamming the laptop shut in a rage. He sneaked back out into the dark alleyway, completely empty-handed and more desperate than ever. I slowly closed my laptop. A cold, hard, genuine smile spread across my face for the first time in weeks. The trap was perfectly set. The devastating evidence was permanently secured. The bomb was primed. All I had to do now was wait for the wedding bells to ring. The entire week leading up to the wedding was a masterclass in psychological torture and emotional endurance. I had to live inside a house that felt like a hostile, foreign territory. I was sharing a bed with a woman who was actively, cheerfully plotting my complete financial ruin. Every single morning, I would wake up before the sun, put on my heavy work boots, and drive to the restaurant, carrying the weight of this massive, ticking time bomb in my chest. And every single evening, I would come home to a living room completely covered in expensive floral arrangements, elaborate seating charts, and miles of imported silk ribbons. Vanessa was absolutely in her element. She buzzed around the house with this sickeningly sweet, triumphant, and utterly arrogant energy. She genuinely thought she had broken me. She truly believed that my silence, my long hours at work, and my constant stalling were just the final, pathetic gasps of a defeated man who was finally accepting his subservient place at the bottom of her family's hierarchy. She would casually bring up Julian's grand future plans for Iron and Oak over dinner, slicing her chicken while telling me how incredibly exciting it was that the restaurant was finally going to get a proper, educated management structure. She talked about the commercial real estate value of my building, casually mentioning how Julian could leverage the property to secure massive corporate loans. She even had the absolute nerve to suggest that Julian might keep me on his new payroll as a low-level kitchen consultant, drawing a meager salary, as long as I learned to respect his new authority and didn't get in the way of his corporate vision. I had to grip my fork under the table so hard my hand physically cramped just to keep myself from laughing directly in her face. The rehearsal dinner was held 2 nights before the actual wedding. They booked a private, gold-leaf dining room at the most exclusive country club in the city. This was the kind of establishment where the annual membership fees alone could easily pay off a standard 30-year mortgage. I wore my absolute best tailored suit, but the moment I walked through those heavy oak doors, I still felt the familiar, condescending stares from Richard and Martha's elite social circle. To these people, I was nothing more than the blue-collar charity case. I was the guy who permanently smelled like hickory smoke and barbecue sauce, the outsider who was finally doing his required duty and paying his heavy financial toll to be a part of their pristine world. We sat down at a massive, long table decorated with thousands of dollars worth of imported white orchids. The expensive vintage wine was flowing freely, and the sheer, unadulterated arrogance in that room was so incredibly thick you could practically choke on it. Julian was holding court at the head of the table, his suit perfectly pressed, his arm draped casually around Fiona's shoulders. Fiona, to her absolute credit, deserved an Academy Award for her performance that night. She smiled perfectly, she nodded at all the right times, and she graciously accepted the endless toasts to their future. But every now and then, when the room was loud and people were distracted, our eyes would meet across the crystal wine glasses. In those brief seconds, we shared a silent, steely, unbreakable understanding. We were the only 2 people in that entire room who were actually living in reality. We knew the storm that was coming. Uncle Gregory, the slimy, fast-talking real estate broker who had insulted me weeks ago, stood up to make a toast. He tapped his heavy silver knife against his crystal champagne flute, demanding the immediate attention of the entire room. The chatter died down. To Julian and Fiona, Gregory boomed, his face slightly red from the expensive bourbon, raising his glass high. And to incredible new beginnings. We all know Julian has a brilliant, unmatched mind for business. It is a truly beautiful thing to see a family supporting its own. Harrison, stepping down and handing over that prime piece of commercial real estate and a high-revenue business is the most honorable, selfless thing you could possibly do. It is essentially an early inheritance for the next generation of this family. You are securing the Richards family legacy, and we all commend you for finally knowing when it is time to step aside and let the real professionals take the wheel. The entire table erupted in polite, golf clap applause. Richard raised his glass directly to me with a smug, patriarchal, deeply insulting nod of approval. Martha dabbed at the corners of her eyes with a monogrammed silk napkin, perfectly playing the role of the overwhelmed, grateful matriarch. Vanessa squeezed my thigh under the table, a clear, unspoken command for me to accept the praise. I stood up. The room instantly quieted down. They were fully expecting me to deliver a subservient, defeated, groveling speech about how honored I was to serve their family. I slowly picked up my glass of sparkling water. I didn't touch the alcohol. I needed my mind perfectly sharp. I looked directly at Gregory, then at Richard, then I locked eyes with my wife. "Family is everything," I said, my voice cutting clearly and coldly through the quiet, opulent room. "But you never really know the true value of a business, or the true foundation of a marriage, until you see exactly what people are willing to do to protect it. Julian is going to get exactly what he has earned. He is going to get exactly what he deserves. I promise you all that." I raised my glass, They smiled, raising their glasses in return, completely missing the loaded, devastating threat wrapped tightly inside my words. They drank their expensive champagne, celebrating their perceived victory, entirely unaware that the solid ground beneath their polished shoes was about to open up and swallow them whole. The morning of the wedding arrived with a chaotic, suffocating blur of frantic makeup artists, stressed photographers, and constantly ringing cell phones. Vanessa was getting ready in the massive master suite, barking aggressive orders at her terrified bridesmaids. I stayed out of her way. I went into our home office, quietly packed a heavy duffel bag with a few changes of clothes, my passport, my financial ledgers, and all my essential legal documents. I walked out to the driveway and locked the bag securely in the trunk of my truck. I took one last look at the house. I knew with absolute certainty that I was never coming back to this property. The wedding venue was spectacularly excessive. It was a massive, historic stone mansion overlooking the ocean cliffs, rented out for an astronomical $50,000 just for the evening. The sprawling lawns were perfectly manicured. A live string quartet was playing classical music on the terrace, and 400 of the city's wealthiest, most influential people were slowly taking their seats on the white wooden chairs. I arrived 2 full hours early. I deliberately avoided the groomsmen's suite where Julian was getting ready. Instead, I went straight into the main reception hall and hunted down the lead audiovisual technician. He was a young guy, untangling a massive pile of microphone cables behind a black curtain. I walked up to him, pulled a crisp, folded $100 bill from my wallet, and handed it to him along with a small, encrypted USB drive. I told him there was a slight, very important change to the evening's schedule. I explained that instead of the standard, boring photo slideshow that was scheduled to play during the father of the bride's speech, I had a very special, extremely high-definition video surprise for the groom. I told him it was a family secret, and I needed it patched directly into the main projector and the venue's massive surround sound system, ready to play the exact second I gave him the signal. He looked at the $100 bill, looked at the USB drive, and shrugged. He didn't ask a single question. He plugged the drive into his master laptop, quickly tested the video feed to ensure the 4K resolution rendered perfectly on the giant 20-foot screen, and gave me a solid thumbs up. I walked out of the dark reception hall and out into the bright gardens to take my seat in the second row. The ocean breeze was cool against my face, but the blood rushing through my ears sounded like a massive freight train. The ceremony itself went off without a single hitch. Fiona walked down the long, flower-covered aisle looking absolutely stunning in her white gown, though I could clearly see the slight, nervous tremor in her hands clutching the bouquet. Julian looked like a model on a magazine cover, smiling that arrogant, completely unearned smile of a man who thought he had the entire world handed to him on a silver platter. They stood before the officiant. They exchanged their vows. They promised to love, to honor, and to cherish each other until death parted them. It genuinely made me sick to my stomach, standing there in my tailored suit, knowing the sheer, toxic volume of lies and deceit standing on that altar. Julian was promising his life to a woman while actively planning to destroy mine to pay off violent criminals. But I simply sat there and waited. The ceremony was just the polite appetizer. I didn't want to cause a scene in the gardens. I wanted the main course. I wanted the reception. I wanted the grand stage, the microphones, and the undivided attention of every single person who had ever looked down on me. The grand reception hall was a blinding sea of sparkling crystal chandeliers, endlessly flowing expensive champagne, and the loud, forced laughter of high society. 400 affluent guests were seated at massive round tables covered in pristine white silk linens. I sat directly next to Vanessa at the long, elevated head family table facing the entire room. She was practically glowing with victory, graciously accepting congratulations and compliments from wealthy socialites and distant, judging relatives. Underneath the heavy tablecloth, she aggressively squeezed my hand, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my skin. She leaned in, her expensive perfume masking the smell of the catered food, and whispered directly into my ear. After the main toasts, My father is going to take the microphone and officially announce the restaurant transfer to the entire room. Just smile, Harrison. Wave to the crowd. Look happy, and whatever you do, do not make a scene and embarrass this family. I didn't answer her. I didn't pull my hand away. I just took a very slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee and watched the room buzz with fake happiness. The extravagant 5-course dinner was served. The plates were eventually cleared by a small army of waiters, and the loud clinking of silverware against crystal glasses began to signal the start of the speeches. Richard, wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that probably cost more than my first car, confidently strode up the short steps to the main stage. He tapped the microphone. The feedback whined briefly before settling into a clear hum. The room instantly fell into a respectful, highly expectant silence. Friends, family, esteemed colleagues, and honored guests, Richard began, his deep, authoritative voice echoing perfectly off the high, vaulted ceilings. Tonight, we are gathered to celebrate the beautiful union of my remarkable son, Julian, and his incredible bride, Fiona. But tonight is about much more than just a wedding. It is about legacy. It is about securing the future and passing the torch to the next generation. Julian has always possessed a brilliant, unstoppable entrepreneurial spirit, and it is finally time he takes his rightful, hard-earned place in the competitive business world. Richard paused dramatically, gesturing grandly with his free hand toward our elevated table. The spotlight shifted, blinding me for a fraction of a second. My son-in-law, Harrison, has spent the last few years building a wonderful little food establishment, Richard continued, his tone dripping with patronizing condescension. But as we all in this room know, taking a local business to the true corporate level, turning it into an empire, requires a certain pedigree, a certain vision. Tonight, as a monumental wedding gift, Harrison and my daughter Vanessa are officially transferring total ownership of Iron and Oak to Julian, giving him the solid foundation he needs to build his legacy. The massive room erupted into thunderous, deafening applause. 400 people were cheering, raising their expensive glasses in a grand salute. Julian stood up from his chair, casually buttoning his suit jacket, waving to the cheering crowd with a sickeningly modest, fake smile. Vanessa nudged me sharply and violently in the ribs with her elbow, her eyes widening in a clear command for me to stand up and play my subservient part. I stood up. The applause began to die down into a low murmur as I slowly walked past the long family table, walked up the short wooden steps, and stepped directly onto the main stage. Richard patted me patronizingly on the shoulder, a heavy, controlling grip, and handed me the microphone. He expected me to say thank you. I stood there in the center of the stage for a long, agonizing moment. I looked out over the endless sea of faces, 400 wealthy people staring right at me, waiting for the blue-collar worker to surrender his life. I looked down at Julian, who was grinning from ear to ear, practically vibrating with greed. I looked at Vanessa, who gave me a tight, warning nod, her eyes silently threatening me. Richard is absolutely right, I said. My voice was completely steady, cold as ice, and it echoed like a gunshot through the massive hall. Tonight is absolutely about legacy. It is about truth. And it is about seeing exactly what kind of people you are dealing with when the doors are finally closed and the money is on the table. I shifted my gaze directly to Julian. His arrogant smile faltered slightly, his brow furrowing in confusion. Julian, I continued, my voice amplifying, you demanded my business. You told this entire family that my 8 years of blood, sweat, and tears were nothing more than grunt work. You actively planned to fire my loyal staff, the people who built that place. You planned to cut the quality of my food, buy cheap garbage, and completely gut the soul of my restaurant. And you demanded, with a straight face, that I hand it all over to you as a free gift. A low, uncomfortable murmur rippled rapidly through the massive crowd. Guests shifted nervously in their seats. This was absolutely not the standard, happy, self-deprecating wedding toast they were expecting. Richard took a sudden, aggressive step toward me, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. Harrison, What the hell are you doing? Stick to the script. Stop this right now. I completely ignored him. I raised my left hand high in the air and signaled the audiovisual booth at the very back of the room. But I am not giving you iron and oak, Julian, I said, my voice dropping an octave, ringing with absolute, undeniable authority over the murmurs. In fact, as of yesterday morning, my lawyer finalized the paperwork. Iron and Oak was officially placed into an irrevocable corporate trust. I am the sole trustee. Cannot be sold, it cannot be transferred, and it absolutely cannot be leveraged for cash by anyone. Not by me, not by my wife, and certainly not by you. Vanessa shot out of her chair so fast she knocked over her wine glass. It shattered on the floor. Her face drained of all color, turning a sickly white. Harrison, shut your mouth and stop it right now. Because I know exactly why you want it, Julian. I pressed on, my voice rising powerfully over the growing, frantic panic at the family table. I know everything about the $300,000 in gambling debts. I know about your hidden offshore accounts. I know about the violent loan sharks actively threatening to break your legs. And I know that your wealthy parents, and my own wife, actively conspired to steal my business just to pay off your criminal creditors. The entire room exploded into genuine gasps of horror. Absolute, unmitigated, shocked chaos. Martha let out a high-pitched, theatrical shriek and collapsed heavily back into her chair, clutching her pearls. Richard violently lunged for the microphone, but I stepped back quickly, holding it far out of his reach. Turn the screens on, I yelled directly to the AV booth. Behind me on the stage, the massive 20-foot projector screen violently flickered to life. The soft, ambient classical music playing in the background was instantly cut off, replaced by the crystal-clear, high-definition audio of Julian violently kicking my heavy steel floor safe. The 4K security footage flooded the dark room with bright light. 400 horrified guests sat in dead silence as they watched the groom, dressed in a dark, sweaty hoodie, break into my restaurant in the dead of the night. The audio was flawless. They heard him cursing wildly. They watched him desperately, pathetically trying to guess the safe combination. They watched him hack into my computer terminal, frantically trying to steal my bank routing numbers to illegally wire money to his loan sharks. Julian stood frozen at the head table. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with absolute, primal, undeniable terror. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights of a massive freight train. There was no spinning this. There was no lying his way out. Turn it off, Richard bellowed at the top of his lungs, his face purple with absolute rage, waving his arms frantically at the AV booth in the back. Turn that garbage off immediately. This is a private family matter. This is a fabricated lie. It is a 4K resolution lie with a verified digital timestamp. Richard. I fired back into the microphone, my voice dominating the room. Then, Fiona stood up. The bride, standing tall in her stunning, custom white gown, calmly picked up her own microphone from the sweetheart table. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. She looked completely resolved. It is not a lie. Fiona's voice echoed clearly through the massive hall, instantly silencing the frantic murmurs of the crowd. She looked at Julian with a look of utter, profound disgust. He is a total fraud. He is a severe gambling addict, he is a thief, and he is a coward. I found his hidden debt ledgers. I found the violent threats from the loan sharks. I am absolutely not marrying a man who would destroy an innocent person's entire life just to save his own pathetic skin. She reached down to her left hand. She pulled the massive, expensive diamond engagement ring off her finger, and she threw it as hard as she could. The diamond bounced sharply off Julian's chest and clattered loudly onto the polished hardwood dance floor. The wedding is officially off, Fiona announced, dropping the microphone onto the table with a heavy thud. Julian completely snapped. The public humiliation, the undeniable exposure, the absolute, total destruction of his pristine golden boy image broke his mind. He lunged away from the table and ran toward the stage, screaming my name, his fists clenched in a blind rage. You ruined my life. I'll kill you, Harrison. I will take every single thing from you. But before his foot even touched the first wooden step of the stage, the heavy oak double doors at the very back of the reception hall slammed open with a deafening crash. Sequan Bennett, a veteran cop who frequented my restaurant, along with 3 other heavily armed, uniformed police officers, marched aggressively into the room. Their police radios crackled loudly in the sudden, dead silence of the hall. "Julian Richards," Officer Bennett said loudly, his hand resting casually but firmly on his utility belt as he approached the stage. "We have an active, signed warrant for your arrest for felony breaking and entering, attempted commercial burglary, and corporate espionage. Turn around immediately and put your hands behind your back." The wealthy crowd parted like the Red Sea. Nobody dared to try and stop them. Not even Richard, who was standing frozen in shock. Julian was openly sobbing now, a pathetic, weeping, broken mess, begging his father to do something, anything, as the cold steel handcuffs clicked tightly and loudly around his wrists. Officer Bennett read him his Miranda rights in a bored, authoritative voice, and the 4 officers dragged the groom out of his own lavish wedding reception, marching him right past the towering, untouched, 5-tier wedding cake. I slowly lowered the microphone. I looked down at Vanessa. She was standing completely frozen at the table, her hands covering her mouth in sheer horror, thick black mascara and tears streaming rapidly down her face. Her perfect, meticulously planned life had been utterly annihilated in less than 5 minutes. I walked calmly down the steps of the stage. I reached inside my tailored suit jacket, pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope, and dropped it directly onto her dinner plate, right next to her half-eaten, expensive filet mignon. "Those are the final divorce papers," I said, my voice completely empty of any anger or emotion. "Sylvia has already filed them with the court. Because of the trust, you get absolutely nothing from the business. Don't ever call me, and don't ever come near my restaurant again." I turned my back on the screaming family, the hysterically crying mother, and the hundreds of utterly shocked guests. I walked slowly and calmly down the center aisle, out the massive front doors, and stepped into the cool, refreshing night air. I got into my truck, started the engine, and drove away. I had never felt so incredibly light in my entire life. The absolute fallout over the next 48 hours was nothing short of biblical destruction. The massive scandal ripped through their elite, tight-knit social circles like a wildfire fueled by gasoline. You simply cannot have the groom arrested in handcuffs in front of 400 of the city's wealthiest, most notorious gossips and expect to keep the story quiet. By Sunday morning, the local newspapers and online blogs had picked up the official police report. Julian's humiliating mugshot, complete with his tear-stained face, red eyes, and a ruined, unbowdied tuxedo, was plastered on the front page of the local news site under the massive, bold headline, "High Society Groom Arrested at Altar for Corporate Theft." The Monday morning immediately following the non-wedding, I walked into Iron and Oak at 5 a.m. The air smelled like fresh, strong coffee, burning hickory wood, and absolute freedom. The sun was shining through the front windows. I felt like I had finally excised a massive, suffocating tumor from my brain. I didn't have to look over my shoulder anymore. I didn't have to pretend. My very first order of business that morning was cleaning house and severing the final infected ties to Julian. I picked up the office phone and called Dominic, the shady, low-grade meat supplier that Julian had aggressively bragged about bringing in to cut costs. I didn't give him a professional month's notice. I didn't negotiate his contract. I told him flat out that his services were terminated effectively immediately, and if I ever saw one of his delivery trucks anywhere near my loading dock again, I would report his numerous, undocumented health code violations directly to the FDA and have his warehouse shut down. He screamed at me and slammed the phone down, and with that click, I officially cut the last lingering thread to Julian's toxic influence. At exactly noon, right as the lunch rush was starting, the heavy front glass door of the restaurant slowly pushed open. Vanessa walked in. If I hadn't known her, I wouldn't have recognized her. She looked entirely, completely, and utterly destroyed. The pristine, arrogant, perfectly manicured woman in the designer cream trench coat was entirely gone. She was wearing baggy gray sweatpants and a stained, oversized sweater. Her hair was unwashed, tangled, and pulled into a messy, desperate knot. Her eyes were swollen almost completely shut from 3 straight days of crying. The sheer, impenetrable entitlement that had fueled her entire existence had evaporated into thin air, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, desperate, hollow shell of a person. She walked slowly up to the front counter where I was standing, reviewing the weekly inventory delivery sheets with Valerie. "Harrison," she whispered, her voice cracking so badly it sounded like grinding sandpaper. "Please, please, I am begging you. We need to talk privately. You have to call the police. You have to drop the criminal charges against Julian. He's looking at real, hard prison time. The judge completely denied his bail this morning because he's considered a massive flight risk with his outstanding debts to the syndicate." I didn't even bother looking up from my clipboard. I kept my eyes focused on the numbers. "I don't have to do a single thing, Vanessa. I am not the one prosecuting him. The state is pressing charges based on the undeniable 4K video evidence that I legally provided to them. He broke the law. He committed a felony. He faces the consequences of his own actions." She started sobbing loudly, not caring that customers were starting to stare. She leaned heavily against the polished wooden counter, her legs shaking. "You don't understand what is happening. The loan sharks, they aren't waiting anymore. They are going after my parents right now. Julian used their home address as collateral for his last massive loan. Harrison, my parents are completely ruined." I finally put the pen down and looked up at her, my face devoid of any sympathy. "Richard and Martha have millions of dollars in assets. Let them pay off the loan sharks out of pocket and hire Julian the best defense attorney money can buy. It is absolutely not my problem." Vanessa let out a choked, hysterical, broken laugh that echoed strangely in the restaurant. "They don't have millions, Harrison. That's what I've been trying to tell you this whole time." And right there, standing in the middle of my barbecue restaurant, the final, most pathetic, mind-blowing twist of their entire decades-long charade was finally revealed to me. Through heavy, hyperventilating sobs, Vanessa confessed that her parents' massive wealth was nothing but a fragile, terrifying house of cards built entirely on massive debt, leveraged assets, and constant lies. 2 years ago, to quietly pay off Julian's previous, slightly smaller gambling debts, and to buy him that ridiculous $100,000 Porsche just to keep up social appearances at the country club, Richard and Martha had secretly taken out a massive, crippling second mortgage on their sprawling estate. But it didn't stop there. They had completely liquidated their retirement accounts. They had aggressively drained Vanessa's old college funds that she thought were securing her future. They were literally living month to month, surviving on massive, high-interest credit lines just to maintain their exclusive country club membership and project the absolute illusion of high society status to their snobby friends. When Julian recklessly racked up the new $300,000 debt to violent, underground criminals, the family was entirely, completely out of options. The banks wouldn't give them another dime. They were tapped out, facing imminent foreclosure on their home and the threat of severe physical violence against Julian. They formulated the desperate plan to steal iron and oak. My restaurant was the only legitimate, cash-positive, highly profitable asset anywhere in their immediate orbit. They didn't want Julian to be a businessman. They needed to steal my life's work, drain the business accounts, and destroy my livelihood simply to save themselves from total bankruptcy and the violent wrath of the underground betting syndicate. "They are going to lose the house this week, Harrison," Vanessa sobbed hysterically, her legs giving out as she slid down to her knees right there on the hard tile floor, physically begging me, her hands clasped together. "The bank is officially foreclosing next month. The loan sharks are circling the property. We have absolutely nothing left. My credit is destroyed. Please, you have to give us a massive cash loan against the restaurant's value. You have to save us. You're my husband. You owe me custody of our future." I looked down at the pathetic woman kneeling on the floor, the woman who had happily, willingly plotted to strip me of everything I had built, the woman who had gaslit me, emotionally manipulated me, and treated me like a disposable, blue-collar cash machine. "I don't owe you a damn thing," I said coldly, my voice steady. "You chose your family's toxic lies over our marriage. You let them treat me like garbage for 4 years, and you actively conspired to steal my future to cover up a crime. I filed for divorce. The restaurant is legally locked in a trust. I couldn't give you a single dime even if I wanted to, which I absolutely, unequivocally do not." Valerie, my general manager, stepped out from the swinging kitchen doors. She wiped her hands on a heavily stained apron, her face looking like carved stone. She glared down at Vanessa. "You heard the boss, lady. It is time for you to leave the premises, before I call Officer Bennett to come down here and pick up another member of your criminal family." Vanessa looked up at me one last time, her red eyes desperately searching my face for even a single shred of mercy, or a hint of the man she thought she could easily control. She found absolutely nothing but a brick wall. She slowly stood up, her body trembling violently, and walked out the glass door. 1 month later, the thick, suffocating dust had finally, completely settled over my life. The divorce was finalized incredibly rapidly. Vanessa was completely broke. She couldn't afford a lawyer to fight Sylvia's highly aggressive, ironclad legal filings, because the corporate trust explicitly and legally shielded my business from any marital asset claims, and because we didn't have to deal with a messy custody battle over children. Sylvia absolutely decimated her in court. Vanessa walked away with exactly what she brought into the marriage. Nothing. I walked out of the massive county courthouse a completely free man, carrying nothing but a manila folder of signed legal papers and a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute peace. Interestingly enough, the massive public scandal at the wedding had the exact opposite effect on Iron and Oak than Julian had aggressively threatened. You would think an arrest would hurt a restaurant's reputation. But the local community, utterly disgusted by the sheer entitlement of the high society family and deeply impressed by my refusal to back down and be bullied, rallied around the restaurant in a massive, unprecedented way. Word of mouth spread like wildfire. People wanted to support the guy who stood up to the local snobs. We were doing absolute record numbers. The lines were wrapping around the building every single night. I had to quickly interview and hire 10 new, full-time employees and heavily increase the salary of my existing staff just to handle the massive weekend crowds. On a bright Tuesday afternoon, Mayor Marcus, a regular customer, a man who deeply appreciated hard work, and a highly respected figure in the community, came into the restaurant surrounded by local journalists. He stood in the middle of my dining room, shook my hand firmly, and officially awarded Iron and Oak the city's Small Business Resilience and Integrity Award, handing me a heavy brass plaque. It wasn't just a validation of my slow-smoked barbecue. It was a loud, public validation of my personal integrity and my refusal to be a victim. But the absolute best addition to the restaurant, the one that truly changed the trajectory of the business, came exactly a week later. Fiona walked through the front doors. She was wearing a sharp, professional business suit, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. Since the night she bravely stood up and called off the wedding, she had completely and permanently cut all ties with the toxic social circle she had been dragged into by Julian. We had stayed in touch over the past few weeks, texting back and forth, slowly bonding over the shared, bizarre trauma of narrowly escaping a family of absolute parasites. "I heard through the grapevine that you are actively expanding your catering division," Fiona said, walking into my office and taking a seat across from my desk. "I have a master's degree in corporate financial management. I know how to handle complex ledgers, and I am currently looking for a boss who doesn't gamble away the company payroll." I couldn't help but smile. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a blank, standard employment contract. Fiona was brilliant, highly organized, and fiercely, undeniably loyal. She had risked her own physical safety and her social reputation to bring me that folder and warn me about Julian's debts. She was the one who handed me the ammunition I needed. I didn't even bother conducting a formal interview. I hired her right on the spot as my new director of financial operations, offering her a highly competitive salary. She brought a level of corporate polish, aggressive strategic planning, and financial discipline to Iron and Oak that helped us completely double our catering revenue in less than 6 months. She wasn't just an employee. She became a highly trusted confidant, a crucial business partner, and a genuine, lifelong friend. Late one night, long after the restaurant had officially closed to the public, I stood alone in the dark dining room. The chairs were neatly stacked on the tables. The hardwood floors were freshly mopped, and the faint, incredibly comforting smell of burning hickory smoke and sweet spices lingered heavily in the quiet air. I walked up to the large front window and looked out at the streetlights illuminating the quiet, sleeping city. I stood there and thought deeply about the last 8 years of my life. I thought about the freezing, lonely nights sleeping in the back of the rusted food truck. I thought about the painful burn scars crisscrossing my arms, the relationships I missed, the terrifying financial sacrifices I made to build this place from the dirt up. And I thought about Vanessa, Richard, Martha, and Julian. Society constantly tells us that family is an absolute, unbreakable bond. From the time we are children, we are heavily conditioned to believe that we must quietly endure emotional abuse, psychological manipulation, and severe financial exploitation simply because people happen to share our DNA, or because we signed a piece of paper for a marriage license. We are constantly told to keep the peace, to turn the other cheek, to forgive and forget, and to willingly light ourselves on fire just to keep toxic people warm. I learned the absolute hardest way possible that blood does not automatically make a family. Respect, unwavering loyalty, and mutual protection are what make a real family. Richard, Martha, Julian, and Vanessa were never a family. They were a highly organized cartel of emotional vampires who preyed on the hard work and success of others to maintain their own pathetic delusions of grandeur. By setting an absolute, unbreakable boundary, by refusing to be their quiet, disposable sacrificial lamb, I didn't just save my business from a massive lawsuit and bankruptcy. I saved my own soul. I learned that you absolutely cannot negotiate with pure entitlement. You cannot love someone into respecting you. The only way to effectively deal with people who view your life, your money, and your hard work as their own personal property is to build a massive fortress, lock the heavy iron gates, and let them starve outside in the cold. Today, Iron and Oak is so much more than just a successful restaurant. It is a living testament to survival and boundaries. My incredible staff Valerie, B.P. Truong Hector, Fiona, and the 40 other hardworking, dedicated individuals who show up every day. They are my real family now. We actively protect each other, we build each other up, we celebrate our promotions, and we earn every single thing we have. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far, you're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to draw a hard, painful line to protect your own life's work, your salary, or your sanity from entitled relatives? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey.